The tabloid spoke of a man we would like to hang and the king of depravity. The Times literary supplement spoke of work with an amazing fertility of talent and ideas. Aleister Crowley sought the extremities of life and existence throughout his 70 years on Earth, championing rituals and practices that society found not only immoral, but repugnant for over 50 years, and it earned him lasting fame. But how much of Crowley's reputation as a Satanist and personification of evil is justified? Some years after President Richard Nixon had labeled him the most dangerous man in America, and he had successfully advertised the existence of psychedelic drugs and a free, carefree lifestyle to the people of the United States, Timothy Leary told a PBS interviewer on Late Night America that, "I have long been an admirer of Aleister Crowley, and I think I am carrying on the work that he started over 100 years ago. I'm sorry he isn't around now to appreciate the glories that he started." It's an indicative testament to the impact of a man that is familiar to very few people, but who has likely influenced artists and thinkers that played a central and key role in their lives at some point. Even Nixon naming Leary as America's most dangerous man echoes the label which Crowley earned in his lifetime as the wickedest man in the world. Look to the top left-hand side of the Beatles' landmark Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, still one of the biggest-selling works of art in history, and there is Aleister Crowley staring back at you. Before we look at the lurid and obscene life of the man who scandalized early 20th century Britain, if you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your support will greatly help us keep the channel producing more intriguing content. Edward Alexander Crowley was born in Lymington on Spa in 1875. As the name implies, Lymington was an upper-class town, and Crowley's family were wealthy through a chain of what nowadays would be termed gastropubs. Crowley alehouses were located in numerous outlets around the country, and the fortune that Crowley's grandfather earned was passed on to his son and grandson. Both of them became men of leisure, free to pursue their own interests and preoccupations. Crowley's father, Edward, did this through fundamentalist Christianity. He and his wife Emily were members of the Plymouth Brethren, a group to whom the word of the Bible was taken literally and who began each day reading a chapter from it, along with their servants. The Bible was the only book available to young Alec, as he was known, and he became fascinated with the book of Revelation, the final section of the New Testament, which foretells of a terrible apocalypse and agonizing death for those who are not deemed worthy of heaven. Despite this lack of literary choice within the home, Edward Crowley wrote prolifically on the topic of Christianity in order to try and spread his faith and win new converts, and Alec inherited this talent for producing large quantities of written material. Crowley's relationship with his mother was troubled, and it was she that bequeathed him with the name that would be used in later years as a mark of his infamy. She referred to him as the Beast. Edward Crowley died of cancer when Alec was 11, and it was then that the previously well-behaved and mannerly boy's personality changed, and he began to rebel against the strict dictates of his parents' beliefs. Crowley's mother also moved the family to her brother Tom's home during this time, a man who his biographer, Gary Laughlin, describes as another Plymouth Brethren fanatic, in every way as narrow-minded and intolerant as his sister, and Crowley loathed him from the start. The overwhelming harshness of his life in his Uncle Tom's care likely played a crucial role in Crowley's development, and his single-minded mission to annihilate every aspect of his and Crowley's mother's faith and lifestyle as an adult. Clearly troubled by the death of his father, Alec became violent toward both other children and animals, and according to Laughlin, became obsessed with the images of torture and pain which he had read in the Book of Revelation. Taught by tutors rather than attending school, Alec discovered tobacco and alcohol in his teenage years, and he also became sexually active with a family maid and other women he came into contact with on travels with his tutors. An attempted molestation by one of his tutors also contributed to Alec's revulsion of Christianity, as well as a warped conception of what was right or acceptable in relationships of trust. Crowley got to university, but spent much of his time drinking and having sex with prostitutes, a practice which led to him contracting sexually transmitted diseases. Despite the condition, he continued to have multiple sexual partners, male and female, seemingly untroubled for the next 4 decades. Likely in reaction to his staid and stifling childhood, Crowley rebelled in every conceivable means when he entered the freedom of university life, as well as the physical freedom of distance between himself and his mother. In addition to becoming a voracious reader and even having some success in his own writing, one positive pastime Crowley picked up during this period was mountain climbing, beginning in his early teens and carrying through with increasing seriousness to his 20s. As the 1890s progressed, Crowley began visiting the Alps and other more challenging climbing venues. At the same time, his interest in mystical and pagan study grew in tandem with his climbing, and Crowley had the first of what could be termed spiritual or even supernatural experiences while in Stockholm in 1896. Most biographers link this event with Crowley's first homosexual experience, and he would remain more or less open about his bisexuality throughout his life, despite sexual relations between men being illegal in Britain at the time. Crowley was a very capable climber, setting numerous altitude records before the advent of oxygen tanks on some of the world's most difficult peaks. But in 1905, the reputation he had built up over the previous decade suffered, and he had his first true brush with infamy when he led an expedition to attempt the summit of Kanchenjunga in Nepal. Irked by Crowley's overbearing leadership and his negligent and violent treatment of the native porters, some of his fellow mountaineers attempted to leave the expedition against Crowley's advice. While trying to descend in the evening, they triggered an avalanche that resulted in the death of 3 Nepalese porters, as well as the Swiss climber Alexis Patch. Crowley, who at this time was insisting on being referred to as the Buddha Sahib, or Great Lord, did not come to assist the rescue and ignored the survivors the following morning. The incident effectively ended Crowley's climbing career. Crowley now threw himself wholeheartedly into the occupation of a writer and spiritual leader of neo-pagan practices. The year before the ill-fated Kanchenjunga expedition, Crowley had eloped with his new wife, Rose, to Cairo, where the two indulged in rituals to the ancient gods and had visions of voices speaking to them. Speaking to him through Rose, Crowley reported that the god Horus had informed him that a new epoch was dawning and that a being named Aiwas would act as his guardian angel and show him the path to true enlightenment. From these visions, Crowley wrote what he would call the Book of the Law, the central dictum of which was, "Do what thou wilt, shall be the whole of the law." The next 4 decades of Crowley's life saw a prolific outpouring of writing in spiritual matters, novels, plays, and poetry. At the same time, Crowley reveled in living life as anti-establishment as was possible within his means and capabilities. He held public pagan rites invoking the ancient Greek Eleusis, at which the punch was said to be laced with a hallucinogenic peyote, leading to another tabloid frenzy in 1912, with one paper calling him the most blasphemous and cold-blooded villain of modern times. After he and Rose's child died of typhoid following his desertion of them on a visit to Hong Kong, he carried on with a litany of open relationships with both men and women, at a time when even divorce was a social taboo. During the First World War, Crowley decamped from Britain to the United States, where he joined pro-German groups and wrote tracts in support of the Central Powers that many considered treasonous. Following the war, he set up a commune in Sicily, where he indulged in all manner of sexual and narcotic practices, and invited initiates to follow his teachings and learn to do as they willed. Ironically, life in Crowley's utopia followed much the same lines as his fundamentalist Christian upbringing, with Crowley starting the day in prayer and reading to the group from his own sacred books. After the death of another of his children and that of a young man who had traveled to study Crowley's doctrine, both likely due to the unsanitary conditions of the commune, which had no running water, toilets, and where stray cats and dogs roamed freely through the house, the public outcry was such that Mussolini's government effectively deported Crowley from Italy. Crowley spent the remainder of his life in ever-decreasing circles, wherein he was dependent on the charity of followers and devotees for survival. The fortune he had inherited from his family long squandered. He died at the age of 72 in 1947 in a rented boarding house, his body weakened by a decades-long heroin addiction. A small group of his followers caused a final scandal by holding a ritual to the pagan god Pan at his cremation in Brighton Cemetery. Despite his involvement, albeit indirectly, in a number of deaths, his cold lack of empathy for others and his promotion of practices that were at best self-harming, perhaps what was most shocking in Crowley's own behavior was not particularly what he did, but the fact that he was open about his lifestyle and made no apology for it. Crowley lived in an England which was far more religious and tied to Christian doctrine than the one today. Oscar Wilde was convicted of gross indecency for homosexual acts in 1895, and the mathematician and computer scientist Alan Turing was convicted of the same crime 60 years later in 1952, 5 years after Crowley's death. In between these events, King Edward VIII was forced to abdicate the throne over his relationship with a woman who had divorced her first husband. The answer of Crowley's enduring appeal to later generations, like that of John Lennon, David Bowie, and Jimmy Page, lie then in his anti-authoritarian stance, as well as his ostensible search for a deeper consciousness and mode of living that broke free of the normal strictures of society. His biographer, Lachlan, sums this up when he says, "Crowley was not evil, only insensitive, selfish, and driven by a hunger he seemed unable to satisfy and an incorrigible need to be distracted. Although he did practically everything he could to disgust and infuriate the British society he loathed with an often tedious obstinacy, he also always wanted its acceptance and to be taken for what he never quite was, an English gentleman." For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel. Like the video and leave your suggestions in the comments below.